Okay, I think we'll begin. Yeah. So, welcome everyone to the first of this term series of Friday Nature seminars. And before I introduce our speaker for today, I'll just run through some of the talks that we have going on this term. It's a really exciting lineup. All of these talks at the same time start at the same place as well. Well, they could be in different rooms in the department, but they're always in this department at this time. And if you're not on the mailing list, just go to the Biodiversity Network website and you can join our mailing list if you want to be on this list of talks. To do the highlights of the talks that we've got coming up over this term. Next week, we've got Joe Ball, who's a lecturer in the biology department, talking about nature positive, fact or fiction, and the idea of nature positive strategies. The week after, we've got Catherine Brown from the Wildlife Trust about their action for nature and climate. The week after, we've got Vincent Mertz and Sophia Gomez on below ground forest fungal interactions. The week after, we've got Bob Costanza, one of the founders of ecological economics, and overcoming our societal addiction to growth and building a sustainable well-being future. This coincides with his new book on that topic. The week after, we have Charlie Burrell from NEP on rewilding. And then the following week is still to be confirmed. And the final week is Michael DePledge from the University of Exeter on environment and health. And so a really exciting range of seminars, and we're also learning some exciting ones for the term after as well. So do come and join us for those. And so now moving on to our speaker for today. Viola Heinrich is from the University of Bristol, so soon to move to Berlin. She recently defended her PhD in December, I know, because I was the external examiner for it. And I was, I don't take away Viola's thunder, but those papers that are PhD are in very high impact journals, or about to come out in very high impact journals as well. So it's really, really impressive for something coming out of PhD, and you would hear rather work in the talks today. And did you pass? I think we can assume you pass. Her PhD focuses on what you hear about today, the use of satellite data to improve understanding of carbon emissions and resorption from secondary and degraded forests. And she'll be moving on to the German Research Centre for Geoscience in Poland. Viola, thanks for coming and joining us. And I will just share the screen presentation. Is that full screen online? Yeah, right. Great. Over to you.
Okay. Hi everyone. Hi everyone online as well. Thanks so much for joining me this afternoon. I think you've been just done all the introductions, so I'm just going to carry on talking about the topic of my thesis as well, which is the topic of today, understanding the carbon sink in recovering degraded and secondary forests across the tropics, with a key focus on science, satellites, and also policy. And I also just want to quickly acknowledge all the people on this board, which quite a lot of them who've helped me along this journey, and especially my supervisors, Joe House, who's come with me today, Stephen Sitch from the University of Exeter, TC Hales at the University of Cardiff, and Louise Aragao, who some of you might know as well, from INPI in Brazil. And if you haven't been thinking about tropical forests up until this afternoon, I'll catch you up to speed. There are different ways we can think about tropical forests. One of them potentially as being a patchwork of different types of forests. So we've got, for example, old growth forests, which is how we know them, forests that have experienced little or no detectable disturbances in the recent past. Then we've got what we've called here degraded forests, which are some that have experienced some form of detectable disturbance, but not enough to be classed as a deforestation event. So that's things such as a fire and logging. We also have secondary forests, which are areas that are regrowing on abandoned, deforested lands. And finally, of course, we do have some areas of non-forested lands, which are deforested and can no longer be classed as a forest. And within that, we've included plantations. Now I've got the definitions out of the way. I'm going to be focusing on degraded and secondary forests. And why am I talking about these? I think we can all agree that protecting old growth forests is the most effective strategy of limiting emissions from the land use sector. But in the regions that have already been disturbed, we need to know how much carbon these forests can absorb and can store. And this is really important given the emergencies that we're facing. And we're also currently in the UN decade of ecosystem restoration. And 2023 will see the first global stock take place within the realms of the Paris Agreement. And within that, we really need to understand and accurately be able to quantify all of the carbon fluxes occurring, not just within the fossil fuel sector, but also on land. And secondary and degraded forests have been somewhat not overlooked, but there's been less research done on that. And there's also within programs such as RED+, which I'll put a pin in for now, but where we have ambitions to improve understanding for the carbon stored in secondary and degraded forests in the tropics and beyond as well. And part of my PhD was closely linked to policy and understanding how we can use this data to improve existing guidelines and policy practices that exist. So this is just a screenshot example from what are called the IPCC Good Practice Guidelines. And what we can see here that there is scope to improve these further. So for example, this is looking at the above ground carbon that it can be used, so information for above ground carbon that can be used to help countries with their national reporting of their greenhouse gas inventories, mainly their emissions and their removals. And focusing on forests, obviously, what we can see here that there is currently limited information on different forest types. For example, there's no degraded forest in this column here. Can you find that? Oh, yeah. We also have quite large continental scales, so there's limited information beyond the subcontinental scale. And importantly, there's a currently high uncertainty with lots of these emission and removal factors, which impacts how we can really accurately understand their regrowth.
I'm just going to minimize Zoom things on the screen.
I'll just keep talking. And another component is that we've only got a single growth term for some of these forest types. So really understanding the regrowth rates is often limited to sort of forests that are younger than 20 years or that have been regrowing for more than 20 years, and specifically just secondary forests. So we wanted to understand how we can improve our knowledge of this. And so what do we know about secondary forests already? There's been ample research done on them already, showing that they enable biodiversity to recover in both species richness and composition. Should I just keep admitting them, or is someone else?
Don't worry about it.
There's research that has shown that faster absorbing carbon up to 11 times faster than old growth forests in the neotropics. And with their secondary forests form an important component in many countries' national determined contributions to the Paris Agreement. And we've seen in degraded forests and logged forests in Malaysia and Borneo, for example, Yadvinda showed us that degraded forests have amplified and diverse ecosystems, so they're not as degraded as we might see them. And they can recover their above ground carbon, but they also have very complicated post-disturbance carbon dynamics. We saw a paper in PNAS from Maria Mills the other week and others that showed that there are really complicated ecosystem exchanges arising, as well as post-disturbance mortality. So with what we know in mind, where are the ongoing gaps? There is an aim to improve our understanding of key climate and human disturbances and understand the spatial patterns of these and how this influences their regrowth. And as of recently, there's been no pantropical assessment of the recovery in degraded forests in terms of the above ground carbon that is stored within them. And thirdly, we need to improve our understanding of how much these forests can actually contribute to mitigating or counterbalancing the current emissions that are arising from ongoing forest losses. And this is where the role of satellites come in. So satellites enable us to look back in time using, for example, the Landsat series that starts in the 1980s. And this enables us to really gain an understanding of forest demography through understanding their ages through time. And combining that with satellites' data vast spatial information that we can gain through them, in this case, the above ground carbon map from the European Space Agency, which is available across the globe, we can combine this in a space for time substitution approach. And this was something that I set out to do in my PhD. And this talk is going to be sort of split up into two parts. First of all, it's understanding the secondary forests in the Brazilian Amazon specifically, and later on move towards the pantropics and focus on degraded forests as well. Secondary forests in Brazil currently make up about 20% of the deforested area in the Brazilian biome, which is about 4% of the total area. And Brazil had pledged in 2015 to protect and restore about 12 million hectares of forest. Hopefully that pledge will be in the renewed nationally determined contribution with the changing government. But at the moment, there's limited spatial understanding that currently exists on the forest ages. So there are other products from INPE, for example, the Terra class product, but there is limited understanding of the secondary forest ages within those. But in Brazil, of course, we have lots of field data that's open access for us to use and able to validate and compare methodologies relying primarily on satellite data. So with this sort of framework in mind, I'm going to briefly outline what I did in this first chapter, which was really to understand the spatial patterns of the above ground carbon accumulation in secondary forests, accounting for different environmental and climate and anthropogenic drivers. And the first step, as I mentioned, was really using a data set that goes back in time to identify not just the extent of secondary forests, but also their ages. And I did this with a host of people helping me along the way, especially Celso, who's now in California, and we developed this methodology to track pixels of forest and identify them as secondary forest and track their ages through time. And age is a really important component when understanding the regrowth dynamics of secondary forests. And here is sort of the map that we produced for the secondary forest extent and their ages for the year 2017. And what we can see quite quickly is, if we look at the top right up here, we can see the ability of this pixel tracking algorithm to really identify secondary forests and their ages using INPE's open access Terra class dataset, which doesn't have an age component, but it does nicely map regions that we know are secondary forests. In other regions, there were some issues of misclassification using this data set from MapBiomas, which is, again, an open access data set really available. Where we can see, for example, here, there's an area which is actually an oil palm plantation, which was identified as secondary forest initially. But using the Terra class product, we could mask out these regions to really ensure we're only looking at naturally regrowing secondary forests. Once we had our map of the extent and the ages of the secondary forests, we could combine this with a data set from the European Space Agency, also freely available and open access, which had relatively high spatial resolution for a global data set. So if you're a field scientist, 100 meter spatial resolution is probably quite coarse, but on a global scale, it was quite accessible for us to identify changes and monitor the carbon dynamics in these secondary forests. And we did this using a space for time substitution approach, whereby we looked at the secondary forests in the year 2017 and looked at the associated ages with that. And on top of that, layered the above ground carbon associated with those secondary forest ages. And from that, we could then begin to model the above ground carbon accumulation through time, or as the forest ages. And we use the Chapman-Richmond model of regrowth, which has different types of regrowth, so it's quite dynamic curves, so it doesn't have to be a linear model. it's either log or superwood style. And importantly, we let the model reach the asymptote, which we assigned the above ground carbon value of old growth forests. So with all this sort of modelling in mind, and we then also wanted to look at the impact of different environmental variables. So I've outlined here the sort of climate environmental variables. Again, these were all open access data sets. The reason I keep saying open access data sets is we wanted to make this as open and accessible as possible for as many people and reproducible as well. And again, these were satellite data that were freely available. So we looked at, for example, the average annual shortwave radiation, average precipitation. We used an index for water stress, the maximum cumulative water deficit index. We also looked at soil fertility. And then in addition to that, we looked at the impact that different human disturbances have, namely regions that experience burning and also multiple deforestation events. Multiple being that secondary forests sometimes experience numerous cycles of growth and cutting in this region. So this was something that we developed in this study. And we then broke up or split up the Amazon into 4 different environmental regions using cluster analysis based on the different climate variables. And within those regions, we were able to create different regrowth models according to the climate, but also picking out the forests that have experienced burning and repeated deforestations to create other regrowth models based on these more human disturbances. And then we could have some fun and actually provide policy relevant information and model the carbon sinks and stocks based on these models. So I'm going to move on away from the methods and actually show you some results. So this sort of outlines some of the 6 key environmental and human disturbances that we looked at. And we can see, basically, you can see on the x-axis, these are the secondary forests recovering as they age. And on the y-axis is the above ground carbon that's accumulating through as the forest ages. And we can see within these different environmental and human disturbance regimes, we can see, for example, I just focus on the water deficit index. We can see that regions of secondary forests that experience a very low water deficit, which is in this light blue up here, had much faster carbon accumulation rates compared to the very high water deficient regions, which are in the purple region. And with this sort of initial analysis, we were really pleased to see that we can use satellite data to pick up these differences in above ground carbon accumulation. But this information wasn't as useful if we can't see it spatially. So as I said, we created these different climate regions for the Amazon. And again, only going to focus on 2 of them for the interest of time. So if we look at the northwest region, which is this region up here in dark green, region A, which is a region typically with low water deficiency, low shortwave radiation, generally higher cloud cover, and higher precipitation. And what we can see here is that, well, you actually can't see it because the blue line, which is meant to show the climate-only region, is covered. But what we can see is that we can see the carbon accumulation through as the forest recovers in above ground carbon. And if we sort of take the average regrowth rate in the first 20 years of regrowth, we get a value of about 3 megagrams of carbon that's accumulating in above ground carbon in these forests. And that's the blue line, but we've also included the impact burning and deforestation has and the impact that these 2 drivers have together. And we can see that the regrowth rates are lower, but are only about 20% lower. And actually, as you can see, because all the lines are overlapping, the confidence intervals are overlapping. And where we can see the impact of human disturbances much better is in the southeast region, which is a region classified generally having high water deficiency, moderate shortwave radiation, and low precipitation. And what we can see right from the off is that the climate-only model is showing that regrowth rates are much lower in this region compared to the northwest, about 1.8 megagrams of carbon. So already we can see spatially the differences in the regrowth rates arising. And I should say there was a field-based study that came out from Fernando Elias, and I was really excited to see that the regrowth models that from their field data, they actually found very similar regrowth rates in the southeast region. So when that paper was published, I was really excited. And on top of that, we can also see that the impact of burning and repeated deforestation reduces the regrowth rates much more compared to in the northwest region. So regrowth rates are reduced by about 45%. So with this, we've got 16 regrowth models here, which can be applied across the Amazon and really begins to show us the impact that the climate, but also that human disturbances have on secondary forest regrowth. And as I said, with this, with these 16 models, we can begin to actually apply them and model in this case, the 2017 carbon sink. And we can look at the losses that we experience from secondary forest deforestation, the gains that we get in above ground carbon through recruits of secondary forest and ongoing growth. And we can look at the net changes of the carbon, of the above ground carbon fluxes. And what we found was for the year 2016, 2017, in this example, was that there was a small net increase in the above ground carbon in these secondary forests. What we can also do is have a sort of a counterfactual scenario and consider, well, what would happen if we let these forests regrow and assume that they hadn't experienced any disturbances throughout their regrowth period. And we can begin to understand that what the impact has had of human disturbances such as fire and repeated deforestation. And what we did was we essentially ran the climate only models and applied that to all of the secondary forests and found that the carbon sink would have been about 8% higher had these forests not experienced fire or repeated disturbances from deforestation. We can also use these models to look into the future and predict or provide policy relevant information on the future carbon sink, in this case up to the year 2030. And what we did was we said, well, what would happen if we let all of the forests regrow without any deforestation up to the year 2030? So that's about 13.8 million hectares of land. And what we found that this was the amount of carbon that these forests are accumulating is equivalent to about 6% of the mitigation contribution to Brazil's nationally determined contribution, which is occurring on about 1.6% of Brazil's landmass. However, if we look at sort of the least ambitious policy potentially of just protecting the older secondary forests, those that are 20 years, which is a policy that they have in the state of Para, for example, we would reduce the mitigation potential quite rapidly, and it would be equivalent to just under less than 1% of the mitigation contribution to Brazil's nationally determined contribution. And what I've been working on at the moment, so I'm currently a postdoc at the University of Exeter, I've actually been trying to create this app and using all of these 16 models and apply them onto Google Earth Engine and to sort of predict and apply what we're using the most recent data set from Map Biomass and see how we can, if we're on track to sort of use these policies as we've laid them out here. On the right hand side, you can see the same information on the left, but actually just looking at it's just the derivative of the curve, so looking at the carbon accumulation. And on top of that, if you sort of plot what I've been doing at Exeter in the last couple of months, we've essentially taken the Map Biomass data set, which is now available up to the year 2021, and applied the models I showed you earlier to see whether the rates of change and gain loss in secondary forest was, and how this sort of mapped onto what we, in our sort of different scenarios. And what we can see that in the year 2019, 2020, the amount of carbon, the net carbon that was arising was still a gain and sort of similar in line to almost preserving all secondary forests. But then you can see in the year 2021, we can see a massive reduction in the net carbon accumulation linked to a rise in secondary forest deforestation in this region. So this is sort of just what I've been working on the last couple of weeks. I've not fully digested all of it, and the app's not running yet or working properly. So I'm working on that. But that's sort of something else that we can do with these results. I also just want to acknowledge two other papers that came out around about the same time when I was working on this. And one was from Samia Nunes and others, and the other one was from Charlotte Smith. And actually, these are, and then my papers on the bottom, these are three different papers. We were all basically using developed the same method for detecting secondary forest in the Brazilian Amazon. But we all had three very different results. And I remember speaking to Joe at the time and Louise. I was a bit, not disheartened, but sort of, you thought, oh, these papers already published my method, sort of. And I guess what I just wanted to share with you was that we got very different results, and I guess it gave me confidence. And it was actually a really beautiful thing to see these works developed in parallel, having never actually met these people before the studies were published. So I just wanted to share that with you as well. And moving on to the second part of my talk, which is focusing on the pantropics. And as I said, this was not just looking at secondary forests, but also degraded forests, which had up until now been less well understood in terms of their large-scale regrowth rates, or whether they regrow at all. And what we've shown in the first part of this talk is that we really can use satellite data to understand the above-ground carbon dynamics in secondary forests. We wanted to see if the same applies in degraded forests. And we used another data set from the Joint Research Council from the European Commission, led by Christel van Kutsen and others. And they essentially developed a data set, again using Landsat data, to model or to spatially track different pixels of forest types, but also non-forests. And a key variable that they produced was, or that we developed together, was the year since the forest was last disturbed. And this was essentially a equivalent metric to the secondary forest age that we developed in the Brazilian Amazon. And using this metric, looking at the year since the forest was last disturbed, we can apply the similar learnings to degraded forest. And I should probably say that they used specific algorithms to distinguish secondary forests from degraded forests. So they were looking at sub-annual scale disturbances detectable within the forest canopy at 30-meter resolution. And if these disturbances continued for more than 2.5 years, it was classed as a deforestation event, enabling potentially secondary forests to regrow. If the disturbances were for less than 2.5 years, it was classed as a degraded forest. And that was sort of how these two forest types were distinguished. And we applied sort of the methodology I outlined in the Amazon more generally across the whole region. We also looked at Central Africa and the island of Borneo, and where we applied, wanted to see if this methodology can be applied elsewhere. And it can. Well, we think. It does. So we can see here we can see the above-ground carbon recovery with the year since the forest was last disturbed. And on the left, we can see the degraded forest. And first of all, we can see that for degraded forest, the above-ground carbon doesn't start at zero, because we're assuming there is some residual above-ground carbon that remains, because it's not a clear-cut deforestation event. And what we can begin to unpick here is that first of all, the above-ground carbon losses as a result of degradation vary across these three regions. For example, in Borneo, we can see the largest losses compared to old-growth forest values, which are outlined here. And we can see the largest losses compared to the Amazon and Central Africa. And we've linked this to the hypothesis that in Borneo, there are a lot of the diptera trees which grow in high intensity and high abundance, and which are very economically viable and therefore logged at high intensities, resulting in a large loss in above-ground carbon. In Brazil, in the Amazon, for example, we have a lot of disturbances through fire, for example, and within a cluster of forest, there may be disturbances arising from fire, which could lead to post-disturbance mortality. And as a region of forest might recover, other areas begin to die off. So we might, and this is why we think the net sort of carbon accumulation in the Amazon is lower compared to, for example, in Borneo. And indeed, there are other sort of climate variables that we've tried to adjust this, unpick this further. And on the right here, we can see again the above-ground carbon as it accumulates in secondary forest, starting at or near zero above ground carbon. And one of the key things, obviously, in science is always to compare your results to other studies, which was really important in this approach, especially because we're using satellite data primarily, and we wanted to see how our results compare to field data and other really important studies and names that you might recognize on here. And actually so what I'm showing here is the above ground carbon after 20 years of recovery relative to the average old growth forest values. So it's expressed as a percentage, and what we found, for example, in degraded forests, the forest recovered about 60–65% of their above ground carbon in our study. And then what we can see notably, there's a lot of results, other studies in the Amazon, less in Borneo, and even less so in Africa, in Central Africa. But we found that there was good agreement within this. And I think, although there is still uncertainty within all of these results, it gives us confidence of where we can sort of reduce the margin of error and reduce our uncertainty by applying the use of satellites and really demonstrating what we can do with these satellite data, especially in regions where we might be lacking field data. And also use that as evidence to continue doing fund field data research in regions where we might be lacking, and using the two to complement each other. So I mentioned we also looked at different environmental variables. In this case, I'll be showing you, here I'm showing you the differences in above ground carbon accumulation rates as a split out by the maximum temperature experienced, the average maximum temperature experienced by these different regions. And what we can see that regions that have experienced higher maximum temperatures are those regions where we see lower growth rates, which are about 10–40% lower. And we link this to the fact that in higher temperature regions, we have a higher vapor pressure deficit, which could lead to stomatal closure, and therefore lower rates of photosynthesis and slower growth overall. In Central Africa, and well, actually, where we can see this quite beautifully is in the degraded forest in Borneo. In this figure C here, we can see in regions of low maximum temperature, the regrowth rates are much higher, and in regions of lower maximum temperature, the regrowth rates are much lower. Did I say that right? I hope so. Higher and lower, the other way around. But the picture is quite complicated because, of course, there are other processes at play. I remember in my environment with the Adventa, and we were talking about the impact that soil fertility and different soil composition will have on this. So that's likely to also have an impact. Unfortunately, at the time, there wasn't really a map to our knowledge available of the different soil components. So we were focusing primarily on sort of climate drivers, such as maximum temperature. The next thing that we did was actually model with our carbon accumulation curves that I've shown here again for a reminder. We actually modeled the total carbon that accumulated from 1985, which is when we had the beginning of the period of analysis, all the way to 2018, and look at the total carbon that's accumulated in secondary and in degraded forests across these three regions. And this, so this is showing it spatially as well, and we can see that the total number is about 3,560 teragrams of carbon, which probably doesn't mean very much unless we sort of compare it to something. But one of the things we can draw out from this map, for example, is regions where we are seeing higher carbon stored in these different disturbed forest types. So that's quite useful to see it spatially. But as I said, there's 306,550 teragrams of carbon. What does that actually mean? Well, what we've done is we've compared it to the total above ground carbon that was lost in the same time period as a result of deforestation and degradation. So we looked at, we assumed that if there was a deforestation event, all of the above ground carbon was cleared. And if there was a degradation event, we used the loss in above ground carbon that we modeled in our study. And actually what we found was that the total carbon that was sort of counterbalanced as a result of the recovery in this was only about 26%. So we're still really getting a lot of the continuing emissions from deforestation and degradation, and it shows the relative strengths, but also currently the work that still needs to be done in protecting these different forests. And similarly to what we did in the Brazilian Amazon, we projected these different regrowth models to the future, again to 2030. We are in the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration after all, and to look at the current and future carbon stocks as a function of the year since the forest was last disturbed, or in the case of secondary forests, their age. And what we found was we were getting a lot of above ground carbon storage and high potential in recently disturbed forests. And again, if we let all of these forests regrow up to the year 2030, we get a 32% increase in the 2018 carbon stock. But, there's always a but, we found that a third of the degraded forests were actually deforested at some point up to 2018. So there is high potential for the 2030 stock, as we calculate it, to be very vulnerable to ongoing disturbances. And actually what we found was that the forests that were most vulnerable were those that were recently disturbed. So within the first 6 years of disturbance, about 45% of the third were actually deforested. So what we can do is actually think of what's a more feasible carbon stock for the year 2030, and again trying to make it as policy relevant as possible. What would happen if we preserve just the recently, or at least the recently degraded forests, and preserving the oldest secondary forests? Well, we get a gain of about 369 teragrams of carbon, which is about 50% or 56% of the sort of maximum technical, what's technically feasible with these forests if we let them all regrow. Oh, I'm nearly finished. Sorry. So returning sort of to the title of the talk, which was about the carbon sink in degraded and secondary forests across the tropics. I've talked a bit about science, I've talked a lot about satellites, hopefully I've talked about policy, and what can we gain from what I've told you. I think, or I hope, you agree with me that we can use satellite products to capture their above ground carbon changes in these recovering forests, which are often understudied in field regions, in some regions. At large scale, we can model their above ground carbon recovery and consider, importantly, the different environmental and anthropogenic disturbances that they experience in a spatial scale. And we're capturing the dynamics in a wall-to-wall way, because we're using every pixel of secondary forest and every pixel of degraded forest we can identify. But of course, we need the ongoing older forest conservation as a priority, and we get the added value if we sustainably manage the recovering secondary and degraded forests to really maximise their climate mitigation potential. Both of these works, where one of them was published, the other one was accepted in Nature, which is quite cool. Very cool actually. Still can't quite believe it. But it was quite a journey, and I just want to thank everyone who's helped me along the way. And actually I wanted to end on something which I want to acknowledge where I'm from and my position. I did all of this work sitting in my kitchen in Bristol during a pandemic, and actually I wanted to reflect on the fact that I was using the satellite data and often looking at these forests from above using satellite data. But I came across this tweet from Wanda Petito, who's an indigenous activist in Brazil. I don't know if you want me to read the quote, I think you can read it yourself, but it was really beautiful, and it really reminded me of actually what this work was about. And it sort of actually took me out of my living room in Bristol and actually put me back in the Brazilian Amazon. And it really reminded me of why we're doing this work. And I don't want to what am I trying to say? It was an article that came out the other day in The Guardian, which you should all have a read. And it made me think of sort of the work that I'm doing, the work we're all doing, and whether projects and programs like Red Plus. I was just wanting to pose this question. We don't have to talk about it. We can talk about it at the drinks. Apparently there's drinks later. And actually wondering if we're too focused on the global carbon value of these recovering forests, and whether they actually have other much more important values, such as continuing to provide important livelihoods for people and for animals, and whether we're sort of putting too much emphasis on this single number of carbon and actually forgetting about the dynamics of these quite beautiful, very beautiful forests. So I'll leave it at that, and sorry, that was quite fast.
Very much, Viola. Thanks. And I interrogated you about a month ago, but it's open to the floor for questions. Would you like to take any questions?
Any estimates to mangrove forests?
Do you know what? I haven't done this, but I just got an email yesterday from my supervisor in Exeter, TC Hales, and he's got a PhD student who wants to do exactly that, using this methodology to estimate the above ground carbon in mangroves and their recovery. So not yet, but hopefully soon.
Presumably you want to look at the below water.
Well, this is, yes, exactly. This is sort of, I mean, this whole talk's been above ground carbon. There is ample more happening below the ground and in the forests. Within, especially for mangroves, you would obviously want to look below the water. So the idea for this PhD student, I guess, would be to complement that with looking at the above ground carbon using this methodology. But I think for other forest types, such as mangroves, the below, what happens below the water, below the ground, is equally or more important. Yeah.
Wants to use the, yeah. Thanks. Yeah, and thanks for your last slide. Yeah, that's a very but actually my question was actually going to be, even though I mostly look at this other stuff, was a carbon question, given the, a lot of interesting new data you have there. I was wondering when you said, what's related to carbon question, in that one of your last slides you said, and then if we sustainably manage the secondary forest, what can be the carbon gain? How are you defining sustainably managed?
Yeah, I guess the point being is that it's unrealistic to assume that we let these forests regrow, because they are part of ecosystems that are being used by people, by plants, or by animals. So they will, experience different levels of disturbances in their own beautiful way. So I guess what we were getting at, although we can't really assign these different policy priorities from above using the satellite data, I think it was sort of the idea of letting these forests still be used in a sustainable, not exploiting them and not over degrading them. And also importantly, one thing we found, I mentioned that a third of the forests were degraded forests were deforested, and mostly within the first few years of their disturbance, and actually increasing the duration between disturbances events and letting the forests recover would enable them, I guess, to be used in a sustainable way. Reducing the intensity of the disturbances would help as well. So that's sort of what I meant by sustainably, without being too policy prescriptive, I guess.
Hi, thanks for the really interesting talk, and congratulations on your wonderful PhD thesis. I actually have kind of a specific question. I was really interested in the when you compared your own study to other studies and the findings, across different regions. I was wondering, did you include and exclude in that comparison studies that had done field validations, or was it a mix of studies that had and had not done field validations?
I'll get back. So it was a mixture. Yeah, it was a mixture of different studies. So some of them were field studies as such, and others, such as the Cook pattern one, had some of you might be aware of the Cook pattern paper. They'd used kind of ample field data and published research to create this sort of spatial analysis and machine learning way of modelling above ground carbon. So in answer to your question, we used a variety, and we didn't really distinguish because I've struggled at times to find the right literature. Maybe I wasn't speaking to quite the right people, but I think I did quite a good effort to try and consolidate our knowledge, and speaking to a few people like Christopher Phillipson and Eric Bullock. So we use sort of a combination. Actually, the study by Eric Bullock and Woodcock is combining LiDAR-derived local scale remote sensing data with others. So we used a mixture. I can keep going, but we used a mixture of different. Thanks.
You mentioned that you work on Google Engine Code and most of the things are because in your last slide you showed you're interested in people and the social aspect. I was wondering, the scale that you are working, carbon sequestration, sink, could that be useful for empower local people or local NGOs, researcher, assuming that the Google Earth Engine get them the power and access to data, can they later use an app that is intuitive to calculate the carbon, but that makes that is sound for a local or that is all region?
Yes. Well, I want to say I hope so, but I acknowledge the fact that this work was done, as I said, using global regional scale data sets that are, as you said, 30 meter resolution, which I think it can be used as a sort of potentially jurisdictional level. So hopefully that's sort of the main area of research main area we would be focusing with this sort of scale analysis, but also potentially a sort of evidence base of what can be done and what can be achieved on a regional, on a country scale, on a global scale, in fact. So I think I'm hoping there would be I've just have another thought, but I'm going to try and get to the end of my sentence. I know I'm going to go to the next bit. There is also obviously increasing higher resolution satellite data available. So that's something that I'll hopefully be working with at the GFZ in Potsdam, actually trying to use these data sets. We've got planet data, which is 3 meter resolution. We've got Sentinel-2 data, 10 meter resolution. So hopefully as we get these higher, still top-down products, they will hopefully be able to have a more impact on a local scale. So, I mean, this was sort of proving a methodology that showing that it can be done, and hopefully updated and amended as we get more products coming online. So hopefully is the answer to your question.
Yes, from Vanessa online, about to other types of plants sequester carbon, and I guess related to that, also just talking a bit about it. What is this was for forests? Could we think what we use for other types of vegetation, and I guess at what point, that don't work from scrubland or stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, we were looking at forests, obviously, because we were looking at the above ground carbon in forests, but there are more plants available, as you said, there are more plants than forests, and I think it hopefully can be applied in other forest types or plant types. We talked about mangroves earlier. I haven't tried it in different regions such as grasslands or savanna, for example, but I'm hoping someone does. It can be, could be a cool project to undertake. So, I think I'm sort of thinking to the earlier question, there's more of these satellite data becoming available at high resolution. Hopefully we can distinguish these different plant types with these data sets, and the idea would hopefully be to apply it similarly. One thing I never actually published, but we also did this for planted forests, so it's not quite answering your question, but we also did this for plantations such as oil palms and plantations, and we found that the above ground carbon we could model was actually very similar to what the literature says. So that's obviously a plantation forest, but an oil palm is a tree of some sort. I don't know if it's a well, anyways, we can talk about that later. But I hope it can be done.
Nico?
I wonder why you didn't use the NDVI or some of the NDP products. Was this simply because they were too coarse in resolution, or?
I don't know. Well, I guess it was a point of probably motivation. So I was coming at it from probably more of a policy angle and hoping to provide a carbon accumulation curves that are policy relevant and that can be applied maybe by the IPCC one day. So I think that was the main motivation why we didn't look at things like NDVI. Yes.
Okay,
Oh, yeah, perhaps I could add my congratulations. He's not up to scratch, and Vera major market acting is absolutely against the wall at the moment. So on that level, do you think that your carbon modelling methodology here, do you think it is fit for markets on that? Do you know what I mean by that? Is it at that level of robustness where you can sell carbon credits from it?
I don't want to. I don't know. I guess I was trying to. Well, I think so, but I guess what. I'm thinking I've backed myself into a corner now.
Oh, I didn't mean to do that. It's just very topical at the moment. Yeah.
Yes. Think. What am I trying to say? Carbon is still very important, and we need to understand it from a global carbon perspective as well, to really understand how the global Earth is doing in terms of emissions and removals, and how the global carbon budget within forests sit within that. So I think the motivation for these sort of types of models is much more global scale or a regional scale, jurisdictional scale, but really to improve both our scientific understanding and, as I said, I was hoping for more of an IPCC angle than a Vera angle.
Sorry.
I don't know, maybe
maybe just third chapter and paper weight. Maybe the others just mentioned your third chapter paper where you do compare satellite stuff to IPCC methods and some of the uncertainty in that. Maybe just kind of briefly on that, because I think that's some relevant.
Yeah, well, so I actually brought some slides from my bed. Yeah, so in my last chapter, I was actually looking at the differences in what satellite data estimates from emissions and removals from land, so the Nancy Harris study, which is global scale, comparing that to what national inventories provide as estimates for their emissions and removals from the forest sector, focusing on Brazil, but also Indonesia and Malaysia. And what we found was there are obviously large differences. I think it comes down to definitions as well. What is defined as a forest, what different countries, what different programs, different projects, different people define as a forest, and in this case, they define as a managed forest or an unmanaged forest, for example. So I think it's messy. I don't know, I've lost your question.
I think we don't get to be here because I was going to be more of the Guardian study.
Yes.
I think there was commenting there.
There's a lot of attention gone into the measuring the carbon stock side and recovery side. And I think what Viola's work shows is that at least at a jurisdictional scale, we're doing a pretty good job now. We get a pretty good understanding of the carbon stocks and the rates of recovery. What the article showed is that's not where the problem lies, something like that plus. It's actually what the counterfactual is. What's the baseline deforestation scenarios or degradation scenarios that you're basing your intervention on? And there, what the study showed is that we're not doing a very good job. and but that sort of forecasting the future of what would happen without your project is mostly inflated in those projects. That's where the problem lies, not in the carbon measurements, carbon stocks.
Which is actually a problem we have with the EU forest data, which is under the IPCC approach now they do reference levels. So you've got your reference level, which is your counterfactual, and then you measure against that. But then a lot of EU countries were using a sort of reference level that included policy and led to those overestimates, and that means that the sort of carbon stock in the second commitment period of Kyoto Protocol, it meant because it meant an overinflation of that carbon budget for quite complicated reasons. So now European policy has is stronger on the rules of setting your baselines and your counterfactual. There's only Europe that's using applying those rules. Once that gets through to other countries, which let's face it, the developing countries are at the moment, their guidelines are fairly loose because they don't have so much capacity within their reporting. So once that kind of tightens up, then the methods are there. It's about having the capacity and the data in the countries to be able to do that.
Okay, another question?
Thank you so much. So in your first paper, that you show that gradient of growth, which in West Amazonia is higher, the rate of regrowth of secondary forests, and you show that that's related to having a lower water stress, right, compared to the east, which is in line with our results from Fernando's paper, which is great. However, I have a question that we weren't able to respond on Fernando's paper, so that's why I'm going to pose for you. So don't you think that could be actually an artifact of landscape scale forest cover? Because we don't have forest cover in the east, we have a concentration of deforestation, while in the west you do have forest cover, so you have seeds and you have dispersers. So it's quicker, the recovery, than on the east, which we barely have any forest left, and they are confined to small fragments full of pioneers as per Celsius work. So what do you think? Could that be an artifact that you were finding that in your first paper?
Probably, yes. I mean, I think, yes. I mean, the satellites data show us many beautiful things, but they didn't show us a lot of the key important variables. There was no way of understanding the seed dispersal from the data. On top of that, the soil fertility component could have been improved as well. So there are a lot of sort of finer scale components that we simply can't look at from that data. And I mean, there's a lot going on underneath those 6 simple variables that I outlined that is going on, making it much more dynamic and complex and beautiful. But so I don't know if you could use the satellite. Hopefully this could be used as a potential evidence back to the reviewer who asked that question, or whoever asked the question. That on a regional scale we can pick up these changes, and that is, it can be hopefully linked to things such as seed dispersal, which is why we need satellite data and field data.
Just want to reiterate, really great work, really exciting to see this talk. My question was centered on the fact that the first paper you published, there were 2 others that had similar methodologies. You said that the findings were different, and I was wondering if you could expound upon that a little bit, because reading the titles, like the titles of the papers, they all kind of took a different context.
Yeah,
that was really interesting. So
I realized if I took this up, I'm gonna get that question. It's a really good question. So what I meant was with the method of detecting the secondary forest. So the method that we developed to apply the space for time substitution approach for estimating the above ground carbon, that was just me, us. But so what Samia and others did, I would say they actually looked at more the changes in forest area of the secondary forest. And building up from that, it's actually very pretty. Building up from that, Charlotte and others, they use the IPCC default factors of above ground carbon removals in the secondary forest in Brazil and Amazon. And they found actually, only 10% of the yeah, you can read it. Only 10% of forest loss was mediated by the regrowth. And we actually did something similar in our analysis. The title from our talk was purely based more on this sort of what can be achieved, what is the potential, what can be achieved. But we actually did we did a very similar analysis to Charlotte, and we found that the above ground carbon that was mediated or counterbalanced from loss was about 14%. So actually, when I got that value, I was really excited. That's really, science is matching up. So, I mean, I think we all took very different takes on it, but the point was, I think we all had the same method of detecting the secondary forests, which, yeah, I don't know if that's ever happened to anyone when you saw someone's published a paper, like, oh no, but it was actually worked out really nicely in my favour, and I cite these wonderful papers, and use that as evidence to back up, and really showing the importance of using these data sets, these methods to detect secondary forests, and yeah.
I didn't look enough at this slide where you had this maximum above ground biomass, and the Amazon stuck out so much more, and you had so much more. No,
by region.
it's by the region. What's another slide?
I think it was the one before with the.
Yeah, probably. Because the Amazon really stuck out to be having much higher above ground biomass. And I don't know whether this is because they grow faster and better, or whether they just stand around longer and survive better.
So this is the total carbon stock. So that the reason why the Amazon is so big.
Total count.
It's total.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So maybe a bit misleading on this one, but
Yeah.
Actually, to follow up, when you go back a few on a related thing, the prevailing understanding also is that Borneo has much higher biomass forests, much taller Tetracart forests,
yeah.
and the Amazon having more biomass. It doesn't seem to come through in the old growth data there.
I brought some extra slides. Oh, there it is. So we had that question from the reviewers, and actually, one of the reviewers said the Central Africa has higher above ground biomass than the Amazon, at least. That was sort of the main comparison, but Borneo as well. And yes, the field data shows that there are higher values, and there are probably a number of reasons why this is the case. Partly because the data set we were using, the ESA CCI, has many benefits that has a high uncertainty associated with it. And so what could happen based on the different satellite data products that they're using, the signal saturates in old growth forests. So the estimates to project the above ground carbon or above ground biomass also saturates in old growth forests. What we did was we looked at the JEDI data set, which is sort of what's hot off the market from NASA, and we compared it, which is sort of, we looked at the footprint data, which is 25 meter resolution. We didn't use it because it's just footprint, it's not a wall-to-wall analysis. And what we found actually in the three regions actually that for old growth forest, the above ground carbon is very similar in these two data sets. Potential reasons why that could happen is because, potentially is because we're picking up more of the older secondary forests because we've got more pixels available. So a lot of field data is based on sort of what field works in smaller regions of old growth forest. Whereas here we're picking up all of the pixels identified as old growth forest. We could also be picking up pixels classified as old growth forest that have actually experienced some degradation as well, with small scale disturbances that isn't being picked up by the other Landsat data, but could be being picked up by the above ground biomass product. So there could be some that could explain some of the reason why we're getting lower. But I like to think it's because we're capturing more of the sort of the spatial patterns of the forest. So something to think about, I guess, moving forward.
Great. I'll just perhaps round up with those questions there. I think all this work is fantastic because much of the focus and reporting on what's happening in the tropics has been about the loss curve, right? Deforestation, degradation. The recovery term has always been either pure guess, either ignored or very crude guesswork. And this sort of work really solid geographical numbers to that. So what do you think, this may be a question to Joe, Joe's thought about this for years, how does this change our understanding of net carbon emissions from tropical forests overall, if it does at all? How is that refined? So the next IPCC report, how are we going to talk about tropical land use? Are these sorts of studies going to change those numbers, and in what direction?
I hope, well, I keep saying I hope, I'm very hopeful. I think so, but I also want to acknowledge, well, there's also so much about, so there's work done by other people in California, MP, showing that the degradation term is also a term that we are not really encompassing in the disturbance term. So I think that complements what I've been working on, sort of the opposite, the recovery term, I guess we called it. And I hope that it begins to show that there's more well, actually addressing the sort of second D and the plus in Red Plus, which even if we're not talking about Red Plus, but actually addressing those terms, because as you say, they've been vastly sort of ignored or overlooked. And I do think as more data becomes available, as we do these more in-depth studies, we can hopefully really unpick the sort of the complicated carbon dynamics within it. And yes, hopefully use and actually, yeah, understand more about the carbon recovery in that. So.
Chris, any idea of how much you change our numbers based on this work? So the net land use and forest use
kind of
emissions.
carbon budget number.
I'm going to do that.
No, I'm saying all podcasting. I'm sure you guys.
Well, I think we need to improve our degradation as well. So before we do, we need to develop those in tandem. So probably enhance the carbon sink of the tropical forest at the moment, but we need to really improve our degradation analysis and the disturbance within that. So I'll get back to you in a few years.
Yeah, undoubtedly will increase the uncertainty so much that it's the quantification. But I think it's a good point, and it probably links to forest management modeling. A lot of the global carbon budget is done by models that really don't include management and don't include this degradation and regrowth. And so sort of when you do, you'll expand the uncertainty again, but you also get a better picture of maybe what's going on in different places. I don't think it will. Well, also when you look at the IPCC inventory stuff, a lot of countries are just putting afforestation, reforestation, and deforestation. So the kind of whole forest management stuff is not even done by a lot of countries, especially developing countries. And so when you might start to include that, then you'll get more information that's country relevant about what the potential is for forest management, as opposed to this just sort of stopping, cutting, and regrowing. And it's kind of that understanding the potential that's there. You'll get more noise, you'll see more of the losses and more of the gains. I don't think it will change the big numbers, but at a project level, it's critical.
But isn't the grounds testing that the whole thing at the center of all of this conversation? I mean, I would love to see, like I was saying a few years time, but like see the same graph that you have comparing like the other studies, but the ones that have done like in-field data collection, the ones that haven't, or the ones that have worked like bilaterally with people in country to say, hey, this is what my algorithm shows, what do you see when you go there? Because you might find that like streamlines an awful lot. I mean, what you say is already sort of corresponding quite well between the different papers. You might find that between the two, it's even more like aligned, the ones that do and the ones that don't. And I think that goes down to Colin's question as well about, what is good management. If we never get to the side of, these sites, and we can't really, the degradation issue, I think, is something, one of the reasons it's taking so long is because you have to build that data, someone has to see it, and to be able to create the models, to create the algorithm right.
And yeah, so it's a really exciting way, I think, to build on what you've done, which is like really obviously impressive and refine it would be to be like, okay, let's see what it looks like on the ground.
Great, I think we'll wrap up there. So thanks, Fiona, and congratulations again. I think it's a. So it's everyone going online, or those of you not online, there's drinks now in the atmosphere room, just to just go around the corridor here. So feel free to have a morning for make coffee. See if you have anything.